Thank you very much, Pat, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Particularly looking forward to sharing some great Oregon beer a little bit later today, but at least not before noon. So it's my pleasure to be here. I'd like to particularly extend a thank you to Duncan Wise of the Oregon Business Council for inviting me to join you here today. Through our work and research at the McKinsey Global Institute and our work with clients around the world, we've enjoyed a lot of interest in people trying to understand what's happening in the macro and macroeconomic and business context. But the tremendous uncertainty of the times in which we operate has made the findings and insights that flow from that work even more popular. And while this is flattering, it comes under circumstances that I wish were otherwise. In fact, few things would please me more than having had much less exciting times over the last 3 years. But we are where we are, and I'm encouraged at today's proceedings entitled Not Business as Usual, because it says it all. Regardless of where you sit, the public sector, the private sector, labor, the social sector, across all industries and in businesses small and large, you sense that something is different and that something must give. And you're right. What is clear is that we are poised at an inflection point, one characterized by many unsustainable contradictions. The days of having it all and not paying for it are numbered. Competing demands at odds with one another, something has to give. And for many state and local governments, not to mention countless businesses and households, something already has. The way out of this logjam will come only in the form of real innovation that creates growth and the renewal that we all seek. By innovation, I mean new approaches to the way we govern, innovation in the way and the roles that business plays, in the way we prepare our children to compete in the world, how we fund our pensions, public and private, innovation in our approaches to maintaining and growing the very human, healthcare, and physical infrastructure that makes us competitive. There will undoubtedly be winners and losers in all of this, and today I'd like to share with you some observations about how we can all help assure that we have more winners than losers in Oregon. And I want to do that by first understanding some of the key drivers behind the challenges we face, then grounding our decisions in some facts that can help better shape and allow us to make some of the difficult choices we will have to make. I'm going to do 3 things. First, I'm going to start by describing 5 key trends that, even absent this epic recession, will continue to shape the operating environment for businesses and governments in Oregon and beyond. Then I'm going to turn to the topic that from Salem to Sacramento, from Montgomery to Washington, D.C., seems to suck all of the air out of the room. Where are the jobs going to come from? I'll offer up some ideas and correct some myths that swirl around the answers to this important question and will help shape policy here and elsewhere. And lastly, I'm going to turn to some key actions and opportunity areas that business and government can tackle together to try and ensure that we have a robust recovery. And to be quite clear, the changes required will demand a spirit of collaboration, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. The effort is going to have to be something akin to what the previous generation did in investing and transforming this nation's capabilities after World War II. This is indeed not business as usual. We must radically innovate if we're going to grow and renew. One thing that is clear, no matter where I go in the world, is that the crisis has driven home the dependency that all economies now share. Initial talk of decoupling was premature. The second observation is that the future growth of the U.S. economy is going to hang on our ability to serve and engage more directly the ascendant economies in the developing world. These truths are captured in 5 key trends or crucibles of innovation that are now more important than ever in shaping the economic landscape and our future prospects. The first of these is what we call the Great Rebalancing. The next decade is going to mark the tipping point in a fundamental long-term economic trend that will leave traditional Western economies with a lower share of GDP in the world in 2050 than they had in 1700. Few things are likely to change this trajectory. States and companies that seek a role in understanding and reacting to the shifting world must orient themselves in meaningful ways to capture the realities. With its base of large and especially nimble small to medium-sized enterprises, the mix of agriculture, manufacturing, a strong orientation to the Pacific Rim, and adaptive and cosmopolitan culture, Oregon can prosper from this first trend. But make no mistake, the world's growth will largely be moving east. The second crucible is a productivity imperative. The near-term challenge facing the U.S. economy is how to return to sustainable growth after this recession. Household spending has been hit hard by high unemployment and a debt overhang from the boom years, while the public sector is now adjusting its budgets downwards and hoping and seeking to serve some of the stimulus spending. On top of these short-term constraints, the U.S. faces a longer-term growth challenge caused by a reversal of favorable demographic trends that have fueled growth in the United States over the last 50 years. In order to maintain the growth and living standards that Americans have enjoyed for much of this country's history, the U.S. will need to see productivity growth rise by at least 24% above the already high baseline set over the past 20 years, a rate not achieved since the 1960s. But we do find evidence that U.S. productivity engine is not running out of steam across a diverse set of industries, from retail to aerospace to healthcare. There are sufficient opportunities to meet this productivity challenge over the next decade if we continue to innovate. But let's be clear. We call this productivity challenge an imperative because it's not just a nice to have, it's a must-have if we're going to grow. The third crucible is an increasingly connected global grid. The last 2 decades have witnessed the rise of networks of unimaginable density and complexity just a decade ago. Just as examples, cross-border capital flows have expanded 3 times the rate of GDP growth. Since 1990, trade flows have grown 1.5 times faster than GDP. Many of the products made in China have more than half of their components made elsewhere. 1.5 million people join the global communications grid every day, and if Facebook were a country, it'd be the 3rd most populous country on Earth. The information grid allows every company to be a global company if it wants to be, no matter how small or where they're located. A connected world also demonstrates that this is a volatile world, but one rife with opportunities for companies, consumers, and governments alike, regardless of where they operate. With all this comes the 4th crucible, which is a tension between rapidly rising resource consumption and environmental sustainability. This is sure to prove to be one of the next decade's critical pressure points of how do we ultimately price the planet. The interplay of growing demand, constrained supplies, and increased regulatory and social scrutiny will determine what resources we use, how we use them, and how we pay for them. We already see strong innovations across logistics, agriculture, manufacturing, and other industries that can point the way forward to managing in a world where the factors of production will matter more than ever. The shift means changing our relationship with and attitudes towards commodities that we now take for granted, providing new leverage points for those prepared to innovate and lead from the front. Finally, the last crucible is the role of the market state. The state, and by this I mean government more broadly, not just the state of Oregon, far from withering away, is likely to play an ever larger role in the coming decade for 3 reasons. First, even before the financial crisis, governments everywhere would find themselves increasingly called upon to mitigate the sometimes negative implications of some of the trends I described, particularly the globalization trend. Second, the crisis itself has prompted, as you know, large-scale direct government intervention, both through fiscal stimulus and alternative means of regulation. And lastly, the current levels of public debt are sure to require painful levels of adjustment, as we're already seeing in various parts of Europe, in the United States, and now in most states around the country, at a time when the challenges and wills to tackle this seems to be absent. This is all happening in the context of the eastward spread of economic power I described earlier, making it harder to reach consensus on multilateral approaches to settling the rules of the global game and fostering much more bilateral and regional deal-making. This last factor, the fact that we don't have a global governance structure, means that companies and their government representatives at state and local levels will increasingly have to engage with lots of important regional and national actors to help ensure their ongoing success. So in summary, these 5 crucibles are forging and create the context for the innovation that we're going to need. The shift of wealth from west to east, the dire need for productivity improvement, a global grid connecting us all, the changing nature and demand for natural resources, and the market state and all the changes that that will demand. These challenges are both daunting, but ripe with possibility for those willing to change and innovate. They are crucibles that we cannot ignore and will help set the context for anything that needs to happen in Oregon. Now, I'm sure you're saying, that's just great. Those are big global factors, but what does that have to do with jobs? What are we going to do with the job loss that's been the greatest since the Great Depression? How do we quickly create the jobs that are the heart and soul of the Oregon economy? As I mentioned, this is a question that reigns all over all others around the country when, as Pat just described, unemployment seems to hover in double digits, and in some parts of the state is closer to 14%. Well, let me start my answer to that question by ensuring that you all understand that the jobs challenge is, in fact, a marathon and not a sprint. The scale of this challenge is enormous. There is no quick fix, but action quickly is, in fact, critical. It's important to remember that the U.S. economy has lost more than 7 million jobs net in the last 2 years. The country would need to create more than 200,000 net new jobs each month for the next 7 years to get unemployment back to where it was when it was once considered 5%, once considered normal. This is going to take a while no matter what we do. So where will the new jobs come from? A look at the past 2 economic cycles might be instructive, and those show that job creation depends on more than the size of the business, with new jobs coming from both big and small businesses. Perhaps most not surprisingly, large businesses, those with more than 500 employees, disproportionately drive U.S. R&D spending, pay higher than average compensation, and realize higher labor productivity than other companies, especially during expansions. But each recovery is different. During the economic expansion of the 1990s, large U.S. multinationals, which employ an average of about 1,000 workers in the United States, created jobs more rapidly than other companies. This was true because they dominated the computer and electronics manufacturing industries in particular that drove much of the expansion during that time period. During the more recent expansion of 2002 to 2007, most of the net new jobs came from local service sectors, such as healthcare, construction, and real estate, which comprise large but especially small businesses and have been among those most substantially hit during this recession. What will lead the next recovery is less clear. Will it be more high-tech bio and green tech jobs? Will that solve the problem? Well, there's certainly a lot of talk about green business, biotechnology, and other emerging industries that are poised to create jobs of the future. And they obviously will be part of the solution, especially in the long term. But today, they're in fact, unfortunately, too small to create the millions of jobs that we're going to need in the short term. The semiconductor and biotech industries, for instance, each employ less than 0.5% of U.S. workers. Clean tech workers, such as those in design and those who make wind turbines, solar panel, and others, account for about 0.6% of the workforce. We're going to be able to only create significant numbers of new jobs by both spurring broad-based growth in these industries, as well as a much broader growth, particularly in big sectors such as wholesale, retail, business services, healthcare, and construction. It's in these areas that the right policies and investments, particularly public sector policies, will pay off the fastest. And finally, won't increased exports revive manufacturing employment?